She was lying on an examination table with her hands folded over her belly and the sound of her baby's heartbeat filling the room when her doctor did something she had never done in 14 years of practice. She finished the ultrasound. She helped the woman sit up. She handed her a towel. And then, in a movement so deliberate and so quiet that it felt like something that had been rehearsed in private long before this moment arrived, she folded a small piece of paper, not a prescription, not a referral, not an appointment reminder, but a note for handwritten sentences, and pressed it into the woman's palm with a pressure that said everything the words on the paper were about to confirm. She did not say anything out loud. She smiled at the receptionist on the way out. She called the next patient's name, and the woman whose hand now held the folded note walked through the clinic and through the lobby and across the parking lot and sat in the driver's seat of her car with the engine off and the afternoon sun coming through the windshield, and she opened it. She read it once. She read it again. And everything she thought she understood about her marriage, her body, and the man who had made her breakfast every single morning for the past 4 months dissolved in the space of 4 handwritten sentences on a piece of paper that a doctor had been too afraid to say out loud. By the time this story is finished, you will understand that sometimes the most dangerous place a person can be is inside a life that looks, from the outside, like exactly what they always wanted. Before we go any further, let us know in the comments where you are watching from tonight. We would love to hear from you. And please hit that subscribe button right now so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Now stay with me, because this story begins long before the examination table and long before the note and long before the morning Diana Reeves understood that the person making her feel safe was the same person making her sick. It begins the way all the important stories begin, in an ordinary life, on an ordinary day, before anything had happened yet that required the particular kind of courage this story is going to ask of you. Her name was Diana Reeves, and she was 36 years old, and she had grown up in Charlotte, North Carolina, the middle daughter of a retired nurse named Gloria and a man named Edward who owned a small plumbing business and who believed, with the quiet and undemonstrative conviction of a man who had built everything he had with his own hands, that the most important thing you could teach a child was how to pay attention. He had not meant pay attention in the anxious and defensive way of someone who expects the world to be dangerous, though the world, as Diana would eventually learn, can be dangerous in ways you do not expect and from directions you are not watching. He had meant pay attention in the fullest and most generous sense of the word. Pay attention to what is in front of you, to what people say and what they do not say, to the small details that the world offers up constantly to the people who are looking and that it withholds entirely from the people who are not. Edward Reeves had paid attention his whole life, and he had built a good life from what he noticed, and he had tried to give his daughters the same tool because he understood, with the practical wisdom of a man who knew exactly what every tool was for, that it was the most useful one he had. Diana had taken this gift and carried it with her everywhere. She had paid attention in school, where it translated into a quiet and consistent academic excellence that surprised nobody who knew her and that she never thought of as intelligence, only as the natural consequence of noticing things carefully. She had paid attention to people, which had led her, after a nursing degree she completed at 23, to pivot entirely toward medical social work, toward the space between the clinical management of illness and the human being living inside it, the family circumstances and the fear and the life conditions that made some people heal faster than others, and that the medical system, brilliant as it was, rarely had time to address. She had worked for 8 years at a hospital in Charlotte doing exactly this work, and she was good at it in the specific and irreplaceable way that people are good at things that align perfectly with who they actually are, things they would do for free if the world allowed it, and that they are lucky enough to be allowed to do for a living. She had a small apartment in the Noda neighborhood of Charlotte that she had filled over the years with plants she had kept alive through the particular attentiveness that plants require, and secondhand furniture she had found at weekend markets and prints from local artists whose work she could not always afford, but whose vision she could not always resist. She had a best friend named Rochelle who had been her closest friend since the 7th grade at Myers Park Middle School, a woman who knew Diana with the specific and irreplaceable knowledge of someone who has been present for every version of a person, the awkward version and the confident version and the heartbroken version and the triumphant version, and who loves all of them with a loyalty that does not require the person to be their best version in order to be fully loved. Diana had a life she had built carefully and with intention, and that was, by the standards of the life she had imagined for herself when she was young, substantially everything she had hoped it would be. She was happy, not the performed happiness of someone who is telling themselves a story, but the real and grounded happiness of a woman who knows what she has and values it, and does not take it for granted because she understands, from years of working in hospitals, how quickly and how completely the things you have can be taken from you. She met Nathan Reeves at a hospital fundraising event in the fall of her 32nd year. He was 40, recently relocated to Charlotte from Houston for a corporate project management position, a man who carried himself with the particular ease of someone who had always known how to read a room and give it exactly what it required. He was organized and precise and attentive in ways that Diana, who had grown up watching her father build trust one kept promise at a time, found deeply attractive. He called when he said he would call. He remembered the small things, the name of the street she grew up on, the professor she had loved in graduate school, the book that had made her cry when she was 22. He made her feel, from the very beginning, like the most carefully observed person in whatever room they shared. And for a woman whose primary gift was paying attention, being paid attention to was the most powerful thing anyone had ever offered her. They dated for 18 months. She introduced him to Rochelle on a Sunday afternoon in February, 5 months into the relationship, and Rochelle had been warm and welcoming and had called Diana that evening and said, "He's attentive." Diana had said, "I know." Rochelle had said, "Attentive can mean a lot of different things." Diana had laughed and said she knew what Rochelle meant and that she was being careful and that everything was fine. Rochelle had said okay. She had not pushed. She was the kind of friend who said her piece once and trusted the person she loved to hear it. And she trusted Diana, who paid attention to everything, to pay attention to this too. She had paid attention. And what she had found, in 18 months of careful observation, was a man who was consistent and considered and who seemed, in every way she knew how to measure, to be exactly what he appeared to be. They were married on a Saturday in May in the garden of a friend's property outside Charlotte with 60 people present and Rochelle standing beside Diana in a dress the color of the spring sky and crying before the ceremony had properly begun because Diana had never looked more like herself than she did that morning, clear-eyed and steady and entirely present, the way she looked when she was doing something she had decided on completely. Nathan held her hands during the vows and said them without looking away, and Diana thought, in the specific and private language of a woman who has been careful about a thing for a long time and has finally allowed herself to stop being careful, that she had been right to trust what she had seen. The first 2 years of the marriage were good. She would always be able to say this honestly, without qualification. They were genuinely good. Nathan was present and engaged, and he remembered her preferences and her rhythms and the names of her colleagues and the details of her cases. And there was in the texture of their daily life together a warmth and a consideration that made Diana feel, for the first time in her adult life, entirely at home inside a relationship. Rochelle came for dinner every few weeks, and the three of them laughed easily around Diana's kitchen table, and the life that was assembling itself felt, from the inside, like the life she had always been building toward. The changes, when they came, did not arrive as changes. They arrived as adjustments, as the natural, barely perceptible evolution of a relationship that had been running for 2 years and was settling into its long-term shape. The first thing that shifted was Nathan's involvement in what she ate. It began simply enough. He had always enjoyed cooking, and in the early months of their marriage his cooking had been one of the pleasures of their shared life. But somewhere in the second year it became something more deliberate, more managed, more attentive in a way that crossed an invisible line between care and control so gradually that Diana could not have identified the moment it happened. He began researching nutrition with a focus that went beyond casual interest. He bought books on supplements and micronutrients and began preparing her meals with a precision that she found touching and, occasionally, slightly overwhelming. If she cooked for herself when he was working late, he would ask what she had eaten with a thoroughness that she told herself was love and that she now understands was inventory. The second thing that shifted was his relationship to her friendships. It did not happen through prohibition. Nathan was too intelligent for prohibition. It happened through observation. A series of small and apparently reasonable observations about the people in Diana's life that accumulated over months into a quiet, but persistent narrative in which the things that had sustained her before him became, one by one, slightly suspect. He did not tell her not to see Rochelle. He mentioned, periodically, that Rochelle's energy seemed unsettled and that Diana always seemed more stressed after they spent time together. He mentioned it casually, observationally, with the tone of someone sharing a concern rather than issuing a directive. Diana began seeing Rochelle less. She did not realize this was happening as a pattern until she was already inside it, which is, she would later understand, exactly how these things work. The third shift was the most significant and the most invisible of all, and it had to do with Diana's sense of her own judgment. This one arrived so slowly and through such small and unassuming channels that she could not, even later with all the clarity of distance and understanding, identify a single moment when it began. It arrived through questions, through the way Nathan responded when she made a decision he disagreed with. Not with opposition, but with concern, the particular concerned tone of someone who cares about you enough to wonder whether you have thought things through carefully enough. Through the way a conversation that started as a disagreement always ended with Diana wondering whether her original position had been correct, not because he had argued against it, but because he had expressed uncertainty about her reasoning in a way that felt, in the moment, like he was simply trying to help her see something she might be missing. She had spent 36 years trusting her own judgment. By the time she became pregnant, in the third year of the marriage, she was spending more time second-guessing it than she ever had before. She did not have a name for this. She did not know yet that it had a name. The pregnancy was planned and wanted and received by both of them with what appeared to be genuine and equal joy. Diana's OBGYN was a woman named Dr. Patricia Osei, a Ghanaian-American physician who had been practicing in Charlotte for 14 years and who had, over those 14 years and thousands of patient appointments, developed a clinical instinct that went beyond what any textbook or residency program had taught her. She had learned to see the things that did not show up on the chart. She had learned that a woman's body keeps records that her words sometimes do not, and that the most important information in an examination room is not always the information the patient has come in to discuss. She had known Diana for 3 years by the time the pregnancy was confirmed, had seen her through a minor health scare and an annual exam in the early weeks of pregnancy, and she had noticed, over those 3 years, the way Diana had gradually become a slightly smaller and more cautious version of the woman she had been at their first appointment. She had not said anything about this. It was not, strictly speaking, within the scope of what a prenatal appointment was for. And she had told herself, in the way that busy and responsible professionals tell themselves things in the margins of a full caseload, that it was not her place to name what she was observing until she had something concrete enough to justify the naming. By the time Diana arrived for her 20-week appointment, Dr. Osei had something concrete. The blood work from the previous visit had come back. The results sat on Dr. Osei's desk that morning, and she had looked at them for a long time before Diana arrived, and she had thought, with the cold and specific clarity of a clinician who has been doing this long enough to know the difference between the things that worry her and the things that frighten her, that what she was looking at was the second kind of thing. Diana arrived alone. Nathan had a work conflict, she explained, a meeting he could not move. Dr. Osei noted this. She noted it not because a husband missing an ultrasound appointment was unusual. It happened all the time, for entirely benign reasons, but because Diana's explanation of it had a quality to it that she recognized. The quality of a woman who has been making excuses for someone for long enough that the excuses have become automatic, delivered without resentment or even awareness. Simply the reflexive management of how her husband appears to the world outside their home. The ultrasound was conducted with the warm and practiced efficiency that Dr. Osei brought to every appointment. The baby was healthy. The heartbeat was strong and steady and exactly where it needed to be at 20 weeks. She found the head and pointed it out. She found the 4 chambers of the heart and confirmed they were functioning beautifully. She measured the limbs and the skull and the spine, and everything was precisely and perfectly as it should be. Diana lay on the table listening to the heartbeat and crying the quiet and involuntary tears of a woman in the presence of something too large for words, and Dr. Osei handed her a tissue and smiled and said, "Your baby is doing wonderfully." And then the smile settled into something else, something more careful. She moved the ultrasound transducer to a different position and looked at the screen with the focused attention of someone who is confirming something rather than discovering it. And when she was done, she set the transducer down and she said, "Diana, I need to talk to you about your blood results." She said it in a way that was not alarming in its tone, but that contained, in the specific phrasing and in the particular stillness of the professional manner she had shifted into, enough information for Diana, who paid attention, who had always paid attention, who had been paying attention to everything her whole life, to understand that what was about to be said was important. She told Diana what the blood work showed. The iron was critically low. The nutrient levels were depleted in a pattern that was inconsistent with a woman who was eating regularly and taking prenatal vitamins as prescribed. The placenta was showing very early indicators of nutritional insufficiency that, if not addressed, would compromise the baby's development in the coming weeks. She watched Diana's face as she said all of this, and she saw the confusion that she expected and the concern that she expected, and then, just beneath both of those, the particular quality of someone whose body is recognizing something before their mind has caught up with it. She asked Diana about her diet. Diana described it accurately and in detail. She was meticulous. She had always been meticulous. This was not a woman who had been negligent about her prenatal care. She asked about the supplements. Diana described them. She described the prenatal vitamins Nathan had started buying for her 2 months ago, the ones he had said were a better formulation than the ones she had been taking. She described the protein shakes he prepared every morning, blended with spinach and banana, and the supplement powder he had researched and selected, always watching as she finished them, always refilling if she did not drink to the bottom. Dr. Osei listened to all of this with the expression of a doctor who is hearing the thing she was afraid she would hear. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I need to step out for just a few minutes. I will be right back." She stepped into the hallway and stood against the wall with her hands clasped, and she did the thing she had been trained to do in every difficult situation, which was to think before she spoke. She thought about what she knew. She thought about what she could prove. She thought about the previous patient, a woman she had tried to help and who had stayed, and about whom she thought sometimes in the early mornings when her mind was working before the rest of her had woken up, and whose outcome she did not allow herself to dwell on, because dwelling did not help anything. She thought about what her options were right now, in this building, in this practice, with a husband she had never met who prepared every meal and every supplement and every morning shake, and who watched his pregnant wife consume each one to the bottom. She went to her office. She sat at her desk. She took a piece of paper from the drawer and a pen, and she wrote 4 sentences. Then she folded the paper twice, very small, and put it in the pocket of her white coat. She went back to the examination room. She helped Diana clean the ultrasound gel from her belly. She talked her through the next steps, the dietary adjustments, the follow-up appointment, the specialist referral that she was recommending for an additional look at the placental indicators. She spoke clearly and professionally about all of these things and gave Diana nothing in her manner or her words that could be reported back to anyone as unusual or alarming. And then, as she walked Diana to the door and shook her hand in the cheerful and practiced way of a doctor concluding a successful appointment, she transferred the folded paper from her palm to Diana's with a pressure that was not casual and could not be mistaken for anything other than what it was. She looked Diana in the eyes for one deliberate second. Then she said, in a voice the receptionist could hear, "See you in 4 weeks." And she walked back down the hallway to the next patient and closed the door and stood for a moment with her hand on the doorknob and said a quiet and private thing to herself that she would not repeat to anyone until much later. Before we go any further, let us know in the comments where you are watching from. We would love to hear from you. And if you have not yet hit that subscribe button, please do that right now so you never miss any of our upcoming stories. Because what happens next, what Diana does with 4 sentences on a folded piece of paper in the front seat of a parked car on a Tuesday afternoon, is the part of this story that everything else depends on. Diana sat in the driver's seat with the engine off and the afternoon sun coming through the windshield, and she opened the note. She read it once quickly, the way you read something when you are not sure you are ready for what it says. Then she read it again slowly, the way you read something when you know you are going to have to sit with it for the rest of your life. The note said 4 things. It said, your blood results are not consistent with the supplements you described. It said, The pattern I am seeing is consistent with substances that interfere with iron and nutrient absorption at the source. It said, I cannot say more here. And it said, if you trust me, call this number from a phone he has not touched. The number below those 4 sentences was a personal cell phone number with a Charlotte area code and a name written beside it in the same careful handwriting. Dr. Sandra Becky, Forensic Toxicology. Diana sat with the note in her hands, and she felt the particular cold of a realization that you have been approaching for a long time without knowing you were approaching it, and that arrives not as a surprise, but as a confirmation of something your body already knew and was waiting for your mind to catch up with. She thought about the supplements. She thought about the way Nathan had started buying new ones without discussing it with her, presenting them as an improvement he had researched for her benefit. She thought about the protein shakes and the way he watched her drink them and the specific tension in his shoulders the one morning she had poured the remainder down the sink without finishing it. She thought about the meals he had insisted on preparing since the first trimester began, the control he had claimed over her nutrition in the language of care, the way every expression of concern about what she consumed had arrived dressed as love, so that questioning it felt like ingratitude. She thought about all of this in sequence, in the parking lot of her OBGYN's office, with 20 weeks of a baby's life growing inside her and 4 sentences on a piece of paper in her hand. And then she did the thing her father had always told her to do. She paid attention, not to what she wanted to be true, to what was actually in front of her. She did not drive home. She drove to the parking lot of a grocery store 3 miles from the house, and she sat there for 11 minutes, and she called Rochelle. Rochelle answered on the second ring the way she always answered, immediately and completely, as though she had been waiting, which she had not been, but which was simply the quality of her friendship, always fully present when Diana needed her to be. Diana told her everything. The appointment, the blood results, the note, the number. Rochelle listened to all of it without interrupting, which was one of the things Diana had always loved most about her. The ability to hold the full weight of what was being said without trying to reduce it before it had been fully received. When Diana finished, there was a silence that lasted exactly as long as it needed to last, and then Rochelle said, "Where are you right now?" Diana told her. Rochelle said, "Stay there. I am coming." She arrived 19 minutes later and parked beside Diana's car and got in without being asked, and they sat together in the afternoon light, and Rochelle looked at the note and read it twice. And then she looked at Diana, and she said something that Diana would carry with her for a very long time. She said, "How long has it been since you trusted your own body?" Diana thought about this. She thought about the fatigue that had been her constant companion for 3 months that she had attributed to the pregnancy. The brain fog that had settled over her thinking in ways that felt different from the normal cloudiness of the first trimester, heavier and more persistent, like thinking through wet cloth. The dizziness that came in the mornings and that she had reported to Nathan, who had responded each time by adjusting her supplements, increasing the dosage of the formula he had selected, watching her take each capsule with the attentive concern of a man who loves his wife and wants to make sure she is getting what she needs. She had been grateful for his attentiveness. She had told herself it was love. She had been right that it was attentiveness. She had been wrong about what it meant. "Months," she said to Rochelle. "I haven't trusted my own body in months." Rochelle was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "And how long has he been the one deciding what goes into your body?" Diana did not answer immediately. The answer was the same as the first answer. Rochelle did not press. She simply sat in the quiet of the car and let the question exist in the space between them, unhurried and patient, waiting for Diana to do with it what she needed to do. Then she said, "What do you need from me?" And Diana told her. She needed somewhere to stay for a few days that Nathan did not know about. She needed someone to go with her to make the call to Dr. Mbecky's contact and to be present for whatever that call required. And she needed, as quickly as possible, small containers, anything sealable, that she could use to collect samples from the supplements and the protein powder in the kitchen without Nathan knowing anything had been disturbed. Rochelle reached into her purse. She produced 3 small sealed Ziploc bags with the matter-of-fact efficiency of a woman who has spent 30 years being exactly the kind of friend who carries Ziploc bags because you never know when someone you love is going to need one. Diana looked at them. Then she looked at Rochelle. And for the first time since the parking lot outside the clinic, she felt something that was not fear. It was not yet hope, but it was the specific and irreplaceable feeling of not being alone, which is its own kind of survival. She drove home. This was the part of what came next that she would later describe as the hardest thing she had ever done. Not the call to Dr. Mbecki's contact, not the police station, not the court appearances, but the act of driving home and walking through the front door and performing the ordinary movements of an ordinary evening in the life of a marriage she now understood she had been wrong about in the most fundamental and devastating way possible. Nathan was home before her. He was in the kitchen making dinner, his back to the door when she came in, and he turned when he heard her and smiled with the warm and practiced ease that she had been reading as love for 4 years, and that she was now reading as something she did not yet have a word for, but that her body recognized. She smiled back. She said she was tired. He said, "Of course, you have been working too hard. You need to rest more. Come and eat." She sat at the kitchen table and moved food around her plate, and said the right things, and asked the right questions, and performed the surface of the marriage the way you perform something when the alternative to performance is a consequence you are not ready to face. He placed her evening supplements on the table beside her plate, the bottle he had selected and purchased, and that arrived each month in a package addressed to him rather than to her. And she picked up the capsules and pretended to swallow them and palmed them with a careful and deliberate movement she had practiced in the car on the way home. She carried them to the bathroom when she excused herself after dinner and transferred them into the first of Rochelle's Ziploc bags, which she sealed and labeled with the date and the time, and hid at the bottom of the inside pocket of her winter coat, hanging in the back of the bedroom closet, the deep pocket that Nathan had no reason to go into. She repeated this each morning with the protein powder, a small amount transferred carefully into the second bag, sealed and labeled, and hidden in the same place. She did this for 3 days. 3 days of performing a marriage at the kitchen table and in the bedroom and across every ordinary moment of a shared domestic life, paying attention to everything, trusting nothing, waiting. On the 4th morning, she woke up before Nathan and lay in the bed in the gray early light, and she did the quiet inventory of her own body that had become habitual since the first trimester. And she noticed something that stopped her still. The fog was gone. Not entirely, not like a curtain pulled back all at once, but lightened in a way that was unmistakable to a woman who had been living inside it for 3 months. The dizziness that had greeted her every morning was absent. The bone-deep exhaustion that she had attributed to the pregnancy had shifted into something she could now identify as a different thing entirely. Ordinary tiredness, the kind the body produces when it is growing a baby, rather than the other kind, the kind that sits on you like something placed there deliberately. She lay very still in the early light, and she paid attention to what her body was telling her, and she understood, with the cold and certain clarity of a woman whose greatest gift had just given her the most important information of her life, that she had been right to listen to Dr. Osei. She had been right to trust the note. She was not crazy. She was not paranoid. She was a woman who had been paying attention and whose attention had just saved her life. She waited until Nathan left for work. Then she got up and called Rochelle. "I know," she said when Rochelle answered. She did not need to explain what she knew. Rochelle said, "I'm coming." They drove together to a small private medical laboratory on the outskirts of Charlotte. Not the hospital, not anywhere connected to Nathan's professional network. A facility that Dr. Osei had selected specifically because of its discretion and its independence. Dr. Sandra Mbecki was not physically present. She was based at a hospital across the city, but she had arranged for the samples to be received and processed under her name, and she had left instructions that were followed exactly. Diana submitted the samples she had collected, the supplement capsules, the protein powder, and a urine sample she had collected over the previous 48 hours following the instructions Dr. Mbecki had provided during a 20-minute phone call conducted from Rochelle's car in a parking lot of a grocery store 3 towns from the house. She drove home. She continued performing. She waited. The call came 6 days later. She was at the library, the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Public Library on North Tryon Street, somewhere with enough ambient noise that a conversation could be private without being conspicuous, and Rochelle was sitting across the table from her when her phone lit up with the Charlotte number she had saved under the name Sandra. She answered. Dr. Mbecki spoke for 4 minutes. She was precise and clinical, and the information she delivered landed with the specific weight of something that has been confirmed rather than discovered. The supplement capsules contained elevated levels of a compound, a combination of substances that would not appear on a standard prenatal blood panel unless the testing physician knew specifically what to look for, that interfered with iron absorption and induced the kind of chronic fatigue and cognitive impairment that would, in a pregnant woman, be entirely consistent with normal pregnancy symptoms at the level of dosage that had been administered. The compound was not naturally occurring. It was not something that ended up in a supplement bottle through contamination or manufacturing error. It required someone with specific knowledge of nutritional biochemistry to select and someone with consistent daily access to the supplement capsules to administer. Dr. Mbeki said, "I am going to document this formally, and I am going to send my report to the colleague who referred you. I am also going to recommend strongly that you contact law enforcement today." Then she said, "Diana, I need you to hear me. What you have done, the way you handled these 3 days, was exactly right. You paid attention. You collected evidence. You trusted your instincts. You did everything correctly." Diana sat at the library table with the phone against her ear and Rochelle watching her face and the ordinary sounds of a public library going on around her. Children in the story corner, keyboards clicking, the muted announcement of a program starting in room B. And she sat with what she had just been told for a long moment before she trusted herself to speak. Then she said thank you. She meant it in every sense that a human being can mean those 2 words. They went to see the attorney first. Carol Simmons had been practicing family law and domestic abuse litigation in Charlotte for 22 years, and she had, over those 22 years, heard every version of the story that Diana was about to tell her, and had long since developed the particular combination of compassion and strategic precision that the best advocates in this field develop. The ability to hold the full human weight of what their clients are going through while simultaneously constructing the legal architecture that will protect them most effectively. She listened to Diana for 90 minutes without interrupting. She looked at the lab results. She looked at Dr. Osei's clinical documentation. She asked a series of questions that were specific and practical and that told Diana she was being seen clearly, professionally, and without judgment. Then she said, "There is enough here for criminal charges. And there is enough here to protect you and your baby while those charges are being processed." She said, "I want to be honest with you about something. What you are about to do is going to be the hardest thing you have ever done. Not the legal process. The legal process I can guide you through. The hard part is what it costs internally to bring a case against someone you loved and trusted and whose love you believed in. The law can address the behavior. The law cannot address the grief." Diana said she understood. She did understand. She was already carrying it. Carol said, "I am glad you are here. Let's build your case." They went to the Charlotte Police Department's Domestic Violence Unit on a Thursday afternoon, 3 weeks after the note, with the lab results and Dr. Osei's documentation and Carol Simmons walking beside Diana through the door of a building that Diana had driven past 1,000 times without ever imagining she would need to enter. The detective who took her statement was a woman named Sergeant Angela Torres, who had been working domestic abuse cases for 11 years and who received Diana's account with the focused and non-reactive professionalism of someone who has heard the worst things human beings do to each other so many times that nothing shocks her, but nothing has stopped mattering either. Diana gave her statement over 3 hours, in the measured and specific language of a woman who had spent 8 years as a medical social worker and who understood documentation and who knew that the details mattered and that the sequence of events mattered, and that the credibility of what she was saying depended on her ability to present it as clearly and as completely as possible. She was 21 weeks pregnant when she walked into that police station. She was entirely alone in the sense that mattered. She was the only one sitting in the chair. She was the only one whose life had been what it had been. She was the only one who had lain in that bed for 3 days and paid attention to what her own body was telling her. She had never been more frightened. She had also, she would later say, never felt more like herself. The investigation that followed moved with the focused momentum of a case that had physical evidence at its center and a detective at its head who was not in the habit of letting cases with physical evidence lose momentum. Sergeant Torres and her team obtained a warrant for the supplements remaining in the house, a search that Nathan, who did not know that anything had been collected or tested or reported, did not see coming, and the laboratory analysis of those supplements confirmed Dr. Mbecki's findings. They obtained Nathan's financial records and found, in those records, a pattern that began to tell a story beyond Charlotte. Purchases of compounds that were not standard supplement ingredients, made through an online account registered under a name that was not Nathan Reeves, payments that traced back through a series of transfers to a source that investigators eventually connected to a Houston address. The Houston address led to a name. The name led to a phone call that Sergeant Torres made on a Tuesday morning to a woman in Houston who had been waiting, without knowing she was waiting, for exactly this call. Her name was Angela Tran. She had been Nathan Reeves's first wife. She had left Houston 4 years earlier with her 2 children and a restraining order and the absolute and quietly held conviction that nobody was ever going to believe her. She spoke to Sergeant Torres for 2 hours and 40 minutes. Nathan was arrested on a Wednesday morning. Diana was staying at Rochelle's cousin's apartment in Concord. She had moved there quietly and incrementally, removing items from the house one at a time over 10 days in quantities small enough not to be noticed, the practiced careful movement of a woman who has learned to be invisible in her own home and is now using that invisibility to leave it. She heard about the arrest from Carol Simmons, who called her at 8:47 in the morning and said simply, "It's done." Diana sat on the edge of the bed in the small apartment in Concord with the phone in her lap and her hand on her belly, and she felt something move. The baby, a kick, deliberate and strong in the way that the baby's kicks had been for the past several weeks, as though the baby understood what was required and was confirming that she was still there, still growing, still determined to arrive. Diana put both hands on her belly and sat with that movement for a long time. Nathan was charged with domestic assault, intentional administration of a harmful substance, and felony endangerment of a pregnancy. He hired an attorney from Charlotte's most expensive criminal defense firm, who argued that the supplements were legally purchased and that Diana's symptoms were consistent with complications that occur in normal pregnancies, and that the connection between Nathan's purchases and the compounds found in the supplements was circumstantial and insufficiently documented to support a criminal conviction. The argument failed. Dr. Mbecki's forensic analysis was specific and formally documented and testified to by Dr. Mbecki herself in a pretrial hearing that the judge attended with the full and undivided attention of a person who has just heard something that changes the parameters of what they are adjudicating. The testimony from Angela Tran established the pattern. The financial records established the premeditation. Nathan pleaded guilty in week 8 of the proceedings. He was sentenced to 9 years in a North Carolina correctional facility. The restraining order was permanent. Diana gave birth at 38 weeks to a daughter. She was healthy and strong and arrived in the world with the same focused and determined quality that Diana would later say she had been aware of for weeks. A child who had survived things that no child should have to survive, and who had, by some grace that Diana did not have a religious framework for, but that she felt in every cell of her body, come through all of it intact. She named her Patricia. Patricia Osei, who had been told about the name by Carol Simmons 3 days before the birth, received the news in her office between appointments and sat with it for a long time before she went back to her schedule. She attended the baby shower that Rochelle organized in her cousin's apartment in Concord, and she held the invitation in her hands when it arrived and read the message Diana had written inside, and she cried, privately and completely, before she sealed the envelope of her response and mailed it. What Diana had written was this: "You gave me back my life. I am spending it on something worthy of what it cost." Dr. Osei intended to carry those words for the rest of her professional life. She has. Angela Tran flew in from Houston for the sentencing. She and Diana had spoken on the phone twice before they met in person. Long and careful conversations between two women who had been shaped by the same person in ways that were both different and identical. And when they finally stood across from each other in the corridor of the Charlotte courthouse, there was a recognition between them that did not require any of the words they eventually said. They stood together in the courthouse, and then they went to lunch at a diner near the building, and they sat for 4 hours and talked about everything. About Nathan. About the specific and incremental architecture of how he had worked. About the way both of them had paid for trusting the wrong person, and about what they had built from the rubble of that cost. Angela had 2 daughters, both of whom were thriving, both of whom she had raised in Houston with the fierce and purposeful love of a woman who has survived something that should not have been survived and who has decided to live as though it matters that she did. Diana told her about the note. Angela was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "I had a doctor once who almost said something to me. I could see her wanting to. She didn't." She folded her napkin carefully and looked at Diana. "I am glad yours did." Rochelle became baby Patricia's godmother at a small ceremony in the apartment 3 months after the birth, attended by Gloria and Edward Reeves and Carol Simmons and Dr. Osei and Angela Tran, who had flown in from Houston specifically for the occasion and who held Patricia during the ceremony with the particular care of a woman who understands exactly what it cost for this child to be in the world. Edward Reeves, who had not spoken for most of the afternoon because he was not a man who spoke when he was feeling things too large for words, took Diana aside near the end of the evening and held her face in both his hands the way he had when she was small, and he was trying to make sure she was listening, and he said, "You paid attention." She said, "I know, Dad. You taught me." He said, "I know I did." His voice was rough in the way of a father's voice when it is carrying more than it can cleanly hold. He pulled her in and held her for a moment, and then let her go because he was a man who had learned, a long time ago, that some things only needed to be said once to be said for good. Diana returned to work at the hospital 6 months after baby Patricia's birth, part-time at first, and then gradually back to her full caseload. And she brought to every patient encounter the understanding that her years of experience had always given her, plus the understanding that the last year had given her on top of that, which was more specific and more personal, and which changed, in ways she could not always articulate but could always feel, the quality of her presence in a room with someone who was afraid or confused or trapped inside a life they could not yet see clearly enough to leave. She started a blog in the evenings after Patricia was asleep, writing about coercive control and the way it operates in relationships and the small and often invisible signals that a person inside such a relationship might recognize if they knew what they were looking for. The blog found an audience that surprised her. Women from across the country and from Canada and from places she had not expected, writing to her in the comments section and in her inbox with the specific and grateful recognition of people who had found words for things they had been living inside without being able to name. She answered every message. She did not always have answers, but she always had attention, which was sometimes the more valuable thing. She called the organization she eventually built from the blog and the growing community of women who had found their way to it the Note, because that was what it had been, in the end. Not the investigation or the legal proceedings or the forensic analysis or even the courage it had taken to walk into a police station 21 weeks pregnant and give a 3-hour statement. What had started everything was a piece of paper folded twice and pressed into a palm with a deliberate and quiet pressure by a woman who had been afraid to be wrong and had written the note anyway. For sentences. That was all it had taken to begin the chain of events that saved Diana's life and the life of her daughter. For sentences from a doctor who had 14 years of clinical experience and 1 year's worth of professional risk, and all the specific and hard-won knowledge of a woman who had been in the room when the worst had happened before and who had decided, on a Tuesday afternoon in Charlotte, North Carolina, that she was not going to let it happen again if there was any way on earth she could stop it. Dr. Patricia Osei was asked, at a medical conference 2 years after the sentencing, to speak about what she had done, about the decision to write the note rather than have the conversation out loud, about the risk involved, about what she would say to other clinicians in similar situations. She stood at the podium and she looked out at the audience for a moment before she spoke. Then she said, "I almost didn't write it. I want to be honest about that. I have been in this room before, with patients whose situations frightened me, and I have not always acted on what I saw. I have told myself I was not certain enough, that I did not have enough evidence, that it was not my place." She paused. "I was wrong about all of those things every time I said them." She said, "Your place is wherever you can do the most good. And the most good I have ever done in 14 years of medicine was 4 sentences on a piece of paper that I almost did not write." The room was very quiet. Then she said, "Write the note. Whatever form your note takes in your practice, in your life, in your relationship with the people who are counting on you to see them clearly, write it. You will not always be right. You will sometimes be wrong, and it will cost you something. But the times you are right will cost you nothing compared to the cost of having said nothing." She sat down. The room remained quiet for a long moment before the applause began. In the front row, Diana Reeves sat with baby Patricia on her lap, the baby too young to understand the words but old enough to respond to the particular quality of the room's attention, looking out at the audience with the wide and focused eyes of a child who has inherited, from a woman who paid attention her whole life, the same extraordinary gift. Nathan Reeves is serving his sentence. He has not contacted Diana. The restraining order ensures that he cannot. Angela Tran has not heard from him either and considers this, she says, one of the better features of the last 4 years. Diana lives in a neighborhood in Charlotte with a small house and a garden that has plants she has kept alive through the same careful attention she brings to everything, and a daughter who is learning to walk and who approaches the world with the specific and unhurried focus of a child who has no reason yet to be afraid of it. Rochelle lives 3 streets away. They have dinner together on Sundays. Edward Reeves comes down from Charlotte every other weekend and sits in the garden with Patricia in his lap and tells her stories about her mother when she was small, about the questions she used to ask and the things she used to notice and the way she had always paid attention to everything. Patricia listens with her whole body, the way very young children listen before they have learned to be selective about it. Diana watches them from the kitchen window and feels the specific and unhurried fullness of a life that is entirely and safely hers. There is something that people who have survived what Diana survived often say when they are asked to describe the moment everything changed. They say they expected it to feel like a revelation, like a door opening suddenly onto a completely different landscape. They expected drama and clarity and the unmistakable sensation of a before and an after. And some of them got that. Some moments are that clear. But Diana's moment was a folded piece of paper in a parking lot on a Tuesday afternoon, and what it required of her was not drama but attention. The same attention her father had given her. The same attention she had been giving the world her whole life. The same attention she had almost lost, not because she had stopped caring, but because someone had spent 4 years quietly and methodically reducing her access to it, fogging her mind and exhausting her body and narrowing her world until the only clear thing in it was him, and the only story that made sense was the one he was telling. She found her way back to herself through a note, through a friend, through the willingness to test a truth she was terrified of confirming, and through the absolute and foundational understanding, arrived at in a car in a parking lot, paid for over 4 years of a marriage that was something other than what it appeared, that her life was worth the disruption of believing the truth about it, that she deserved to know, that the baby inside her deserved a mother who had chosen to know, that choosing yourself in the moment when everything you have built depends on not choosing yourself is not selfishness. It is survival. And survival, done honestly and without making it prettier than it was, is the bravest and most ordinary and most extraordinary thing a human being can do. Before you go tonight, let us know in the comments where in the world you are watching from. We would love to hear from you. And if this story reached you tonight, if it made you think about something or someone in your own life, please share it. You never know who needs to hear that their instincts are worth trusting, that their body is telling them the truth, that the people who love them will still be there on the other side of the hardest conversation they have ever had. Hit that subscribe button and join us at Letters Never Sent, because next week we have a story that begins with a phone call a woman received 30 years after she gave up a daughter for adoption. A call that came from a direction she never expected, and that contained a truth that reordered everything she thought she understood about the life she had been living. You will not want to miss it. Some letters are never sent. But here, in this quiet space we have built together, they are finally heard.